The first bill I ever held in my hand felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't the paper. It was the weight of the hours behind it. The smell of sweat still clinging to my shirt. The faint grease under my fingernails. The stale perfume of an old office where I had carried boxes long after everyone else had gone home. I remember the flickering light above my head, the buzzing sound it made, and the way the clock on the wall seemed to mock me with each tick. I didn't know it then, but that crumpled note would become a mirror, a reflection of the way I would spend my life chasing, losing, and slowly learning what money really means. Don't forget to subscribe, to leave a comment, and to press the like button before we dive in. Every gesture helps this message reach more people. I wasn't born into wealth. My earliest memories of money weren't of abundance, but of absence. I would sit at the kitchen table and watch my parents sort coins into small piles, their faces bent low under the dim light. The smell of boiled potatoes and cheap coffee filled the air. To me, money was not just numbers. It was tension, silence, and the way my father's jaw clenched whenever bills arrived. That atmosphere planted something inside me, a vow. Perhaps that I would not live my life waiting for the sound of envelopes hitting the floor. The first daily habit I learned wasn't glamorous. It was the discipline of watching every coin. Some call it budgeting, but for me it was survival. I wrote numbers in an old notebook, the paper stained with coffee rings, and I treated each entry as if it were scripture. I counted, I tracked, I measured. That small ritual of writing taught me respect. Respect for money and respect for time. Because every coin represented an hour of my life I could not get back. Years later, when I had more than I could have imagined, the habit remained. Even with accounts and transactions far beyond those early notebooks, I still tracked. Quietly, consistently. And it was this simple act, recording, observing, respecting, that separated me from those who drifted through life, not knowing where their money went. The notebook was my first key, unlocking not wealth itself, but the discipline required to hold on to it. Another habit formed, almost by accident. I saved before I spent. Not because someone taught me, but because I feared the silence at the kitchen table, the heavy air of not knowing if tomorrow would be safe. Each time I received money, I hid a portion away. At first in jars, then in envelopes, and eventually in accounts. The sound of coins dropping into glass became the rhythm of my youth. I didn't realize then that I was building a fortress, not against poverty alone, but against fear. Saving was not just about numbers, it was about peace, about walking through the city streets without the constant hum of anxiety pressing at my chest. It is in these quiet habits, tracking, saving, respecting, that wealth begins, long before numbers grow large enough to impress anyone. Millionaires are rarely built on miracles. They are built on rituals, repeated in silence, when no one is watching. I remember walking through an old library one evening, searching for warmth more than books. The air smelled of dust and ink. The floorboards creaked under my shoes. In that silence, I read something that struck me like a whisper from the future. The man who doesn't control his money will be controlled by it. Those words followed me out of that library, down the cold stone steps, into the night air where the lamps flickered, and the city felt both endless and suffocating. From that moment, I decided I would not be a prisoner of my own earnings. Years later, I look back and realize the third habit was born that night. Living below my means. Not in misery, but in mastery. When the first larger sums reached me, I resisted the temptation to let them slip through my fingers. I kept my life smaller than my income. I wore the same coats through several winters. I drove old cars longer than anyone thought I should. People mocked, whispered, assumed I was stingy. But I was building something invisible, brick by brick, while they were busy decorating crumbling walls. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. The fourth habit was less about numbers and more about focus. Investing time before investing money. I had seen too many men rush chasing tips, rumors, quick wins. I did the opposite. I walked slowly. I read. I asked questions. I learned. Nights bent over books, the smell of ink on my fingers, the echo of a ticking clock as I fell asleep at a desk littered with paper. That patience turned into knowledge, and that knowledge turned into decisions that looked lucky from the outside, but were deliberate from within. And then there was the fifth habit, perhaps the most important: protecting my mornings. It may sound strange, but wealth is not only built in ledgers, it is built in the first hours of the day. Before the world could claim me, before calls and noise and obligations, I sat in silence. Coffee steaming beside me, pen in hand, I planned. I reflected. I asked myself not how to earn more, but how to be more. The morning became my mirror, showing me who I was and who I might become if I stayed the course. These 5 daily habits: tracking, saving, living below my means, investing time before money, and protecting my mornings did not make me rich overnight. They shaped me slowly, like water shaping stone, quietly and relentlessly. And as I look back, I see the path they carved, away from fear, toward freedom. I could continue, but the story does not end neatly. Even now, I hear the ticking clock at night. I smell the paper and ink. I feel the cold of those early mornings. The habits remain as they must, because wealth is not a destination. It is a discipline that lives in each day, each choice, each breath. And somewhere in that rhythm, I found not just money, but myself. The night after the deal closed, I didn't celebrate the way I thought I would. There were bottles in the corner of the room, and congratulations pinned to my phone. But I found myself walking the city alone, the street lamps throwing long, thin shadows across the pavement. The air smelled of rain and something metallic, the aroma of trains and oil and late commerce. In my pocket was a small, battered key someone had given me years before, the sort of key you keep because it belongs to a part of yourself you aren't ready to open yet. I turned it over with my thumb until the skin felt thin, and I realized that the victory I had been promised by others felt thinner than the original hunger that had driven me. That hunger had been fed not by grand gestures, but by the quiet habits that had accreted like sediment around the core of my days. I had written them down in a notebook with a frayed spine. The 5 lines that, repeated daily, had become my architecture. Sometimes people ask me which single thing changed everything for me. I always answered the same way. Nothing single, everything habitual. Wealth arrived as a byproduct of rituals, not as an altar to which I surrendered my life. Take the habit of tracking. There is a particular sound in the early hours of a bank statement arriving, a small ping like a moth hitting glass. In the beginning, the sound would jolt me awake. Now it is a steady rhythm, one I have trained myself to read without panic. Tracking teaches you a vocabulary for your life. What is essential? What is noise? Which relationships cost more than they give? It also reveals invisible leaks, subscriptions, little conveniences, the quiet drip of convenience that becomes a river if left unchecked. Those who scoff at lists often don't realize lists are mirrors. They show you where you are honest and where you are lying to yourself. Living below your means took on a different temperament as I aged. When I was younger, it was austerity and shame braided together. Later, it became a deliberate choice of aesthetics. I learned to find luxury in sufficiency. A hand-stitched notebook, a coat with a story, a single sharp suit that fit like a promise. The house I bought years after the first jar of coins was modest by most standards, but it had light in the mornings and a kitchen that warmed like an honest hearth. People assumed sacrifice. I called it selection. Choosing less for the sake of more. Time, freedom, options became my quiet rebellion against the culture of immediate demonstration. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. Investing time before money is a strange discipline in an era that treats speed as virtue. I learned it the hard way, watching friends lose fortunes because they mistook velocity for wisdom. There is a difference between being first and being right. I remember a meeting in a building where the elevator smelled of citrus and the carpet had the faint imprint of hundreds of hurried shoes. Men in sharp suits offered me graphs that glimmered like siren songs. They promised a future in which money would multiply itself overnight. I asked for the models, the assumptions, the counterfactuals. They laughed at my caution, and later, when the trend reversed, they called it bad luck. Luck is an ugly word for the predictable consequence of impatience. Protecting my mornings changed the way my days unfolded. The world is a thief. It steals your hours with polite requests and urgent nonsense. By claiming the first hour lighting a lamp, sitting with a cup of coffee that steamed and whispered, I built a small sanctuary in which the day's narrative started on my terms. That hour is always quieter than the rest, and in that quiet, decisions are clearer. I plan the small things there. What email to answer, which calls to return, which ideas to nourish, and which to let wither. The habit makes you ruthless in the best way. Selective with your time, tender with your values. Saving before spending is perhaps the least glamorous of the five, but it is the habit that protects you from your best impulses. Once, when I had a fair sum in the bank, and a younger version of myself wanted a new watch, I sat in a cafe and watched people pass with their own carefully chosen weights. I realized that every purchase tells a story about who we want to be. I decided then that I wanted my story to be one where freedom came before ornamentation. Saving became an act of storytelling, the plot twist reserved for the moment when it mattered most. Over time, these habits altered more than my balance sheet. They changed my relationships. Money, when handled without care, is a wedge. I saw friendships cleave along the jagged lines of envy and misunderstanding. There were parties I did not attend because I didn't want to spend the money on nights that faded into unremarkable mornings. There were business dinners where I sat across from people who measured worth by roundness of accounts rather than roundness of trust. It was painful sometimes, and it was necessary. The rituals I kept were not intended to isolate me, but to make me sustainable, in business and in life. business itself turned into a school of ethics. I learned that contracts are not just legal instruments. They are promises you owe to yourself and others. I learned to prefer clarity over cleverness. It is tempting in negotiations to plant seeds of ambiguity that give you breathing room later, but ambiguity corrodes trust. One evening, I stayed late drafting a term sheet that read like a map: clear, fair, and importantly, enforceable. My partner at the time asked why I was making it so explicit. I told him I wanted to be proud of what my signature meant. He laughed. Later, when we were under pressure, that document was the lighthouse that kept us from running aground. There is a subtle arrogance in wealth that many do not notice until it arrives. The belief that because you have some success, you understand the world. Habits are the antidote to arrogance. They keep you humble because they remind you daily of where you began. They require repetition. And repetition is a form of patience that educes humility. When you practice the same small disciplines at dawn and dusk, you are less likely to be seduced by the quick applause of success. Investing, when done from a place of habit, tires toward prudence. I diversified, not because some newsletter advised it, but because my ledger showed me how volatile single points of failure could be. I kept cash reserves, not because it was trendy, but because I had learned the geography of uncertainty, where markets could tilt, where suppliers could falter. That readiness made opportunity look less like a gamble and more like a choice. I took chances, certainly, but I took them from a base of preparation, not desperation. Sometimes people ask whether these habits require suffering. My answer is always that they require trade-offs. To protect your mornings might mean missing an evening function. To live below your means might look like restraint to others, but feels, to me, like choosing a long, steady road over a short, steep climb. The key is to choose the traits that compound into value over years, not just the pleasures that flatten into regret by next season. There are practical rituals I kept as well: a weekly review, a monthly reconciliation, quarterly goals that were about behaviors, not just numbers. Each of these was an invitation to reflect: what worked, what did not, what pattern was repeating itself in my life like a faulty groove on an old record. These reviews were harsh at times. They required me to look in the mirror without flinching, to face the mirror motif I had built into my life. But the mirror does not lie. It simply reflects back what you bring into the room. In the quiet hours before dawn, I still turn the key that sits on my desk. It is worn smooth by years of use. I do not know what door it opened at first, only that it has become a ritual of remembrance. The habits it represents are not commandments. They are invitations to a practice of living that values continuity over noise. I have built teams and companies, navigated crises and moments of grace, and through it all, the small daily acts retained their quiet, disproportionate power. They are humble, stubborn things: a pen, a jar, a notebook, an hour at sunrise. And they have the uncanny ability to transform ordinary days into an architecture of possibility that the loud, headline-seeking world cannot replicate. People imagine millionairehood as an arrival, a moment when the curtain lifts and you step into light. For me, it was more like finding a room within myself I had been walking toward for years. A room lit by steady lamps, lined with books, and a simple clock whose hands move with patience. In that room, I could hear the real measure of wealth, not the clink of coins, but the quiet sense that I could refuse what did not serve me. that I could choose time over treadmill, that I could answer to fewer urgencies and more truths. And yet, paradoxically, the more I gained, the more I saw how much there was left to learn. Habits that served well in one season needed revision in another. The market's grammar changes, relationships shift. Children grow and demand a different kind of attention. So each year, I added a small ritual of reconsideration. An afternoon alone with a pad of paper, asking the same 5 questions about my life that I had been asking since the first notebook. What am I defending? What am I pursuing? What am I afraid to lose? Who am I becoming? Where does my time go? These questions are blunt instruments, but blunt instruments reveal truth quickly. When I teach younger entrepreneurs now, I do not give them blueprints. I give them questions and the insistence that they start small. Start with one habit. Let it sit in your day like a lit candle. Let its light show you the edges of your life. From there, add another candle, then another. And before long, the darkness that once felt inevitable becomes simply a backdrop to a room you understand. Build patience into your calendar as deliberately as you build profit into your models. Honor the mornings. Save before buying. Track not to punish yourself, but to know yourself. There are days when the old hunger returns, sharpened by new possibilities. I am not immune to desire. I still want things that glitter. But the rituals make desire less tyrannical. They let me look at a want and ask whether it is aligned with the long arc I am trying to draw. The paycheck that once felt like a summoning bell now arrives as one note in a larger symphony, meaningful but not absolute. Sometimes in the hum of a late office, I stand and listen to the city breathe. It is there that the clock motif returns, not as accusation, but as companion. Time is the most honest ledger, keeping score in a currency none of us can print more of. I count it in mornings, protect it, in habits repeated, in the quiet accumulation of choices that, compounded, look like fortune from a distance. And so, I keep the routine. I wake. I write. I reconcile. I choose. The daily smallness of these acts is what kept me afloat when storms gathered. Not brilliance, not luck, not even raw willpower, but the invisible scaffolding of repetition. It's remarkable how unremarkable the foundation of wealth appears to others. They expect drama, grand strategies, secret formulas whispered behind closed doors. Yet the truth is closer to a series of half-lit mornings, where the coffee is still steaming, where the air feels sharp against the skin, and where decisions are shaped not by adrenaline, but by quiet intention. I remember one particular morning in winter. The frost had crept across the window pane, delicate veins of ice that looked like maps of unfamiliar countries. The clock ticked in slow defiance of the cold, and the smell of paper filled the room as I flipped through my ledgers. Outside, the city was just beginning to stir, headlights moving like lanterns across wet asphalt. I traced the columns of numbers with my finger, realizing that nothing in my account had changed overnight. Yet something in me had. I no longer looked at the figures with fear. Instead, I saw them as coordinates, markers of where I had been, signposts pointing toward where I could go if I remained steady. That was the moment wealth stopped being about escape and became about navigation. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. Discipline, I discovered, is not about punishment. It is about rhythm. The body responds to rhythm, so does the mind. Each day I rehearsed the same acts: writing, saving, studying, refusing extravagance. And these became the percussion beneath everything else. In a noisy world, rhythm is a kind of shield. It prevents you from chasing every echo, from scattering your focus across the endless temptations that promise urgency but deliver nothing. I sometimes think of it as a drumbeat beneath the surface of my life, steady, reliable, guiding me forward even when I could not see the path clearly. One of the hardest lessons was to understand the cost of impatience. I once entered a partnership too quickly, seduced by the confidence of another man's voice and the gleam of his charts. His office smelled of leather and strong cologne, the kind that clings to your jacket long after you've left. We shook hands, and for a moment I thought I had touched destiny itself. Months later, I was standing in a nearly empty warehouse, listening to the echo of my own footsteps, realizing that much of what he had promised was smoke. The loss was painful, but the greater wound was knowing I had abandoned my habit of patience, my practice of studying before investing. That wound taught me that speed can blind you more than failure ever could. Living below my means saved me in those days, while others who had partnered with him found themselves drowning. I had reserves tucked away, not just in accounts, but in the modest way I had chosen to live. My apartment was small, the kind where the kitchen smelled of everything you cooked, but it was paid for. My clothes were simple, but durable. My car was old, but reliable. These choices, mocked by some, became my parachute when the venture collapsed. There is a strange power in being underestimated. People assume restraint means weakness. They forget that endurance often looks quiet until it proves itself stronger than spectacle. I kept journals not only of money, but of thought. Each evening, I wrote about the choices I had made, why I had turned left instead of right, why I had accepted one meeting and declined another. Those journals, filled with smudged ink and margin notes, became my mirror. When I read them months later, I could see the patterns I had missed in the moment. I could see the mistakes forming like cracks before they widened into fissures. Writing was not just memory, it was foresight, disguised as hindsight. In those pages I learned that the habit of reflection compounds as surely as interest. Protecting my mornings gave me the courage to face those truths. Without that ritual of silence, the world's noise would have swallowed my resolve. There were mornings when the weight of upcoming decisions pressed against my chest before the sun had even risen. I would sit, staring at the steam rising from my cup, listening to the ticking of the wall clock, and ask myself a simple question: what will matter in 10 years? That question stripped away the urgency of most things. It revealed how much of life is distraction dressed in urgency. By filtering through that lens, I avoided countless traps that might have ensnared me with promises of quick gain. The saving habit, the one most people dismiss as too ordinary to matter, is the quiet spine of everything I built. Each act of saving was not merely withholding from the present, it was giving to the future. Over time, those small acts became a conversation between my younger self and the man I was becoming. My younger self would slip coins into a jar, and years later, I would hear his whisper reminding me of why discipline matters. Even now, when accounts hold more than jars ever could, I still imagine the clink of coins. It grounds me, reminds me that every fortune begins with the humility to respect small beginnings. If my words have value for you, support this channel by subscribing and sharing your dream below. But wealth, I must confess, is not only about the self. As it grew, I learned the burden of stewardship. To manage money is to manage influence. To manage influence is to manage responsibility. People began to look at me differently, their eyes calculating, their voices carrying both admiration and expectation. Some asked for advice, others for opportunities, and still others for rescue. It was then I discovered that the truest form of wealth is not accumulation, but allocation. Knowing where to place what you have, so that it multiplies not only for you, but for those around you. In those years, I made mistakes that still haunt me. I funded ventures out of sympathy, confusing compassion with prudence. I gave too quickly, forgetting that generosity without discernment can create dependency rather than freedom. Each time I stumbled, I returned to my habits, to the steady rhythm that had brought me this far. They became the compass I consulted when the fog of guilt or pride obscured the horizon. Without them, I might have been lost in the flattery of others or crushed under the weight of their needs. Business is often portrayed as a battlefield, filled with winners and losers. But to me, it became more like a mirror maze. Every deal, every decision reflected something back at me. My fears, my greed, my patience, my values. I learned to walk slowly through those mirrors, aware that one wrong step could shatter not just glass, but relationships, reputations, even the fragile trust I had built within myself. The mirrors never stopped multiplying, but my habits gave me the courage to keep walking, to keep choosing reflection over reaction. There were nights I returned home long after midnight, the city's pulse still thrumming through the streets. My office smelled of stale coffee and burnt dust from the heater, and the silence was so thick it pressed against my ears. I would drop the keys onto the desk and listen to their clatter, a reminder of doors locked and unlocked, of choices made and paths taken. Those keys became another motif in my life, symbols of both opportunity and responsibility. Each key carried the weight of what I had built, but also the unspoken question of what doors I had yet to open. Time, I realized, is the only currency more precious than money. The clock's hands moved with an indifference that humbled me. Every tick was a transaction. Every talk, a reminder of the debt none of us can repay. My habits did not just build wealth. They bought me moments. Mornings with clarity. Evenings with peace. Afternoons unclaimed by regret. And in those moments, I began to understand that the true dividend of discipline is not numbers in an account, but freedom carved into the architecture of your days. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. Wealth without wisdom is a fragile triumph. I saw men richer than me collapse under the weight of their own appetites. They mistook abundance for immunity, forgetting that fortune is fickle, that markets turn, that time humbles all empires. My habits did not make me immune. They made me resilient. They gave me the strength to absorb losses without despair, to rebuild without bitterness, to continue without the illusion that arrival was permanent. And so, night after night, morning after morning, I kept to them. The notebook, the savings, the modest living, the careful study, the sacred mornings. They are the quiet architecture of a life built not on spectacle, but on steadiness. And while others searched for secrets, I carried mine openly, like a key on a worn ring, jingling softly as I walked through the corridors of my own becoming. Those corridors stretched longer with each passing year, lined not with trophies, but with lessons. Some etched deep into the walls like carvings no one could erase. When I walked them in my mind, I could still hear echoes. The hum of old computers in dim offices, the murmur of late-night negotiations in half-empty restaurants, the restless ticking of clocks that seemed to know more about me than I knew about myself. Each sound, each smell, each sensation tied itself to a decision I had once made, and together they formed a mosaic of my life in business. I can still picture one of those late restaurants. The air was thick with the smell of fried onions and the faint sweetness of wine spilled onto a wooden table. Across from me sat a man whose eyes shone with the kind of ambition that blinds more than it illuminates. He spoke quickly, his hand slicing through the air, promising growth, expansion, inevitability. I listened, I nodded, but beneath the rhythm of his voice I could hear another sound, the steady metronome of my habits, warning me not to move faster than wisdom allowed. I excused myself to the restroom, not because I needed it, but because I needed silence. Standing at the sink, watching the water swirl down the drain, I asked myself the question I always asked in such moments. What would this look like if it failed? When I returned to the table, my decision was already made. I walked away, and though he never forgave me, the choice preserved years of freedom I would have otherwise sacrificed. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. Failures, of course, did come. One in particular felt like the floor giving way beneath me. It was a venture I had nurtured for months, investing not only money, but trust. The office was bright, filled with young energy. The kind of place where coffee cups, cluttered desks, and whiteboards bloomed with ambitious diagrams. I believed in it so fiercely that I ignored the quiet warnings my ledger whispered, the faint tremors in the numbers that suggested instability. When it collapsed, the silence afterward was suffocating. Phones stopped ringing. The smell of fresh paint in the office turned bitter, as if mocking us. I remember standing alone by the window, looking down at the street where people passed, unaware of my private ruin. It was then I understood another hidden habit of millionaires: learning to lose without letting loss define you. That night, I went home, lit only a single lamp, and opened the same notebook I had used for years. My hand shook as I wrote, but I forced myself to list not only the losses, but the lessons. The act of writing steadied me. The mirror of the page reflected not failure alone, but resilience waiting to be chosen. Slowly, I rebuilt. The habit of reflection turned despair into direction, and what felt like an ending became a hinge. Living below my means in those dark months gave me shelter. While others scrambled to maintain appearances, I could retreat into simplicity. My meals were plain, my days stripped of luxury, but they were secure. I discovered a strange beauty in that austerity, the taste of bread when it is earned by your own endurance, the warmth of a coat that has seen too many winters, but still shields you from the cold. These were not just objects, they were testaments to a philosophy, proof that wealth was not about display, but about durability. One morning, after weeks of wrestling with doubt, I sat at my desk just before dawn. The clock ticked in the half-dark, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than fear. I felt possibility. I realized that freedom is not built in the moments when everything works, but in the habits that hold you when everything breaks. That morning, I wrote 3 words on the top of a page. Discipline is mercy. Mercy to myself, mercy to my future, mercy to those who would one day depend on me. Those words became a compass I have carried ever since. If my words have value for you, support this channel by subscribing and sharing your dream below. Over time, wealth began to alter the rhythm of my days, but not the substance of my habits. The notebooks grew thicker, the accounts larger, the choices heavier. Yet the rituals remained. Each coin saved, each morning protected, each decision slowed down by patience. These were the stones that paved the road. Others asked me how I managed risk, how I chose investments, how I balanced ambition with caution. I always answered the same way, by asking the mirror, by listening to the clock, by holding the key of restraint in my pocket. The mirror, for me, was more than a metaphor. In my study hung an old, tarnished mirror I had bought from a flea market in my youth. Its frame was chipped, its glass slightly warped, but it had a presence that commanded reflection. Each morning, I would stand before it, coffee in hand, and ask, would the man I was 10 years ago respect the man I see now? That question cut through vanity, through excuses, through noise. Sometimes the answer was yes. Often it was no. But even in the no, there was clarity. And clarity was the most precious currency I could ever hold. As the years passed, I noticed that those who ignored such questions began to stumble. They lived louder, earned faster, spent harder. But when the tide turned, their castles of sand dissolved in the waves. I did not gloat. Instead, I felt a quiet sorrow, knowing that it could just as easily have been me had I not clung to the quiet power of daily habits. Even now, with more than I once dreamed of, I wake before the sun. I write in notebooks. I save before I spend. I live smaller than my means. I study before I act. And I protect my mornings like a treasure no one else can see. These rituals are not burdens. They are freedoms disguised as discipline. They are the keys that open doors not just to wealth, but to peace. And in the silence of those early hours, when the city is still half asleep, I hear the faint ticking of the clock. It reminds me that time is the only account we cannot refill, the only ledger that never lies. Each tick is a question. What are you doing with me? And each talk is an answer, written not in words, but in habits, in choices, in the life you are quietly building while others sleep. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. And so I continue, not toward an ending, but toward a practice, the daily discipline that shapes not just money, but meaning. For while wealth can be counted, its truest value is lived in mornings of clarity, in choices made without fear, in the freedom to walk through the corridors of your own life, knowing that the keys in your hand, worn and humble, have opened the right doors. Those doors did not swing open all at once. They yielded slowly, sometimes grudgingly, as if testing whether I was patient enough to deserve entry. That was one of the earliest truths the habits taught me. Doors are not broken into. They are unlocked over years. Each saved coin was a notch in the key, each morning of quiet reflection, a turn in the lock. Eventually, the doors opened, not because I demanded it, but because I had become the kind of man who could walk through them without destroying what lay inside. There is a memory I return to often, not of wealth, but of hunger. I was younger, sitting in a rented office that smelled of mildew and old paper. The walls were thin, and I could hear the muffled laughter of a cafe next door, people spilling coins and joy without thought. I stared at the cracked paint on my desk and wondered if my effort was foolish. The ledger in front of me showed more red than black, and for a moment I thought of abandoning it all, trading uncertainty for comfort. But then I heard the clock, the tick-tock, relentless, uncaring, steady. I realized the clock was impartial. It rewarded the consistent, not the desperate. That night I stayed, wrote, tracked, saved, dreamed. Years later, that office would be demolished, but the rhythm I learned there never left me. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. The first real breakthrough came not with a sudden windfall, but with compounding, the slow, almost invisible accumulation that others often overlook. Compounding is not just a financial principle, it is a life principle. Habits compound into character, character compounds into destiny. The notebook I kept was not glamorous. It was filled with smudged ink, numbers, scratches where my pen dug too deep. But line after line, day after day, it built a map of where I had been, and without realizing it, of where I was going. I did not need brilliance. I needed persistence. Compounding is a silent ally. It whispers while others shout, but in the end, its voice carries further. Living below my means continued to be misunderstood. Friends invited me to holidays in places where the sun cost more than it gave, where drinks sparkled under artificial lights, and luxury was a mask for emptiness. I declined, often with embarrassment, sometimes with quiet defiance. I walked the city streets instead, noticing the way morning light glinted off windows, the way bakeries smelled of yeast and sugar, the way silence carried more wealth than noise. Those walks taught me another truth. Riches are not only measured in accounts, but in the capacity to see the world without the fog of constant desire. Investing time before money saved me from countless illusions. There was a man once who offered me entry into a venture that could not fail. His office was a shrine to opulence, glass tables, leather chairs, the faint scent of cigars lingering in the air. He spoke with authority, and I could see why others followed him. But when I asked for the details, for the numbers, for the patience of explanation, his confidence frayed. I left, and months later, his empire collapsed. Some called it scandal, others bad luck. I called it inevitable. Patience, I learned, reveals cracks long before collapse. Protecting my mornings was perhaps the most radical habit of all. In those hours, I was not a businessman, not a negotiator, not a provider. I was simply a man with a pen, a cup of coffee, and a question. What matters most today? Sometimes the answer was profit. Sometimes it was peace. Sometimes it was saying no to both. That hour gave me authority over the rest of the day. Without it, I would have been tossed about by demands, drowned in urgency. With it, I became the author of my own time. If my words have value for you, support this channel by subscribing and sharing your dream below. Wealth, as it grew, began to change the people around me. Some drew closer, drawn by the gravity of opportunity. Others drifted away, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the man I was becoming. I learned to discern between those who loved me for my habits and those who wanted me for my harvest. It was not always easy. Betrayal wears the face of friendship until it no longer needs the disguise. But again, the habits protected me. By tracking, by saving, by living smaller, I ensured that even betrayals did not sink me. The scars remained, yes, but scars are maps, proof of survival, reminders of strength. The motif of the mirror deepened in those years. I found myself standing before reflective glass, not just in my study, but in hotel rooms, in offices, in elevators that smelled of steel and electricity. Each reflection asked the same question. Do you still belong to your habits, or have you let your wealth claim you? I answered truthfully only when I lived truthfully. And when I strayed, for I did stray, it was the mirror that called me back. There is no harsher critic than your own eyes staring back at you, unblinking. Keys, too, multiplied. Real keys to offices, safes, warehouses. Metaphorical keys to relationships, networks, opportunities. I kept them all on a single ring, heavy in my pocket, reminding me that every door I opened carried responsibility. Each key was a promise, to employees, to partners, to myself. The jingling sound became both comfort and caution. Comfort because it meant progress. Caution because it meant weight. Wealth is a weight as much as it is a freedom, and the key ring reminded me never to mistake one for the other. Time, above all, remained the strictest teacher. I once sat at the bedside of a mentor, a man richer than I would ever be. His hands trembled. His breath was shallow. His eyes fixed not on me, but on the clock on the wall. He whispered, almost to himself, "All the money, and not one more hour." That moment seared itself into me. From then on, I measured every deal, every opportunity, not only in profit, but in time. Would it give me more of it, or would it take it away? That became the ultimate calculation, and it reshaped my choices more than any number in a ledger ever could. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. And so the journey continued, not in leaps, but in steps, each one grounded in the habits that had carried me from scarcity to sufficiency, from fear to freedom. The world looked at the results and called them wealth. I looked at the habits and called them life. And in the stillness of each morning, with the clock ticking, the mirror waiting, and the keys heavy in my pocket, I remembered that the real fortune was not what I held, but what I had become through the holding. The becoming was slower than anyone on the outside ever imagined. People like to compress a life into headlines. The first million, the big deal, the so-called breakthrough. But my life, like most real lives, was not a straight line upward. It was a series of long corridors punctuated by small rooms, each with its own smell, its own weight, its own lesson. Some rooms were dim and smelled of dust and failure. Others were bright with possibility, the air alive with voices, and the aroma of fresh paper contracts being signed. Each room left a trace on me, like the faint scent of cologne that lingers on a jacket even after the man is gone. The first real room of success was small and unassuming. It wasn't a skyscraper office or a high-rise view. It was a converted attic that smelled of old wood and insulation, where the light bulb buzzed faintly every few minutes. There, I made my first profit worth remembering. I sat alone when the call came through, the phone warm against my ear, and when it ended, silence filled the attic in a way I will never forget. I expected joy, but what I felt was responsibility. The notebook lay open in front of me, and without hesitation I wrote the numbers down, then wrote beside them, "Do not waste this." That scribbled command became a covenant, one I kept through seasons of both famine and feast. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. The famine seasons tested me more than the feasts ever did. There was one winter when I nearly lost everything. The market shifted violently, deals collapsed, and money bled out faster than it came in. I can still feel the cold of those nights, wrapped in a coat indoors because I refused to turn the heating higher. The air smelled of iron from the old radiators, the windows fogged with my breath. My savings, the fortress I had built, coin by coin, saved me. It was not wealth then, it was survival. While others went bankrupt, I tightened the belt, lived with less, and endured. People underestimate how much endurance is worth in the currency of wealth. Endurance buys time, and time buys recovery. Living below my means made those recoveries possible. It wasn't glamorous to eat simple meals, to wear shoes long past their shine, to drive a car whose engine groaned like an old man. But simplicity was my shield. No one can take from you what you have chosen not to need. In that restraint, I found freedom, a kind of invisible armor against the chaos of fortune. I would walk the streets at night, hearing the city groan and hum, and I would feel oddly light, as though my modest life was a raft that kept me above the waves that drowned others. The habit of reflection kept me sane. In the darkest season, I returned again and again to the mirror in my study. Sometimes in the dim lamplight, I could hardly recognize myself. Eyes sunken, face lined with stress. And yet, the mirror never lied, never softened. It asked, "Are you still the man who began with nothing but discipline?" I had to answer. Sometimes my voice broke when I said yes. Other times, I had to confess no, and then start again the next morning. Those conversations with myself were harsher than any boardroom negotiation, but they were also more valuable. They kept me aligned when the world tried to pull me apart. If my words have value for you, support this channel by subscribing and sharing your dream below. There's a story I rarely tell, but it belongs here. I once nearly sold myself, not my work, not my company, but myself. A powerful man approached me with an offer that glittered. Wealth, influence, access to corridors I had only glimpsed from afar. His office smelled of leather and whiskey, the kind of room where secrets stick to the walls. For a week, I carried his offer like a stone in my chest. The money was seductive, the opportunity intoxicating. But one morning, before dawn, I sat with my coffee steaming in the quiet and asked, "If I take this, who will I become?" The answer that stared back from the mirror was someone I could not respect. I turned him down, and though I walked away poorer in the short term, I remained rich in the long one. That decision reminded me that money without integrity is a chain, not a key. The key motif followed me everywhere. Keys jangling in my pocket when I unlocked new offices. Keys to safes that smelled faintly of steel and dust, where documents rested like sleeping animals. keys that symbolized not only access, but burden. For every door opened, another room to tend, another responsibility to shoulder. I learned to carry them with reverence. A key is not just an invitation, it is a question. Are you ready for what lies behind this door? Many times, I delayed turning the lock until I could answer truthfully. And always, there was the clock. Its ticking was a constant sermon. I could be in a hotel room, high above a city, curtains drawn back to reveal rivers of light below, and still the clock would speak. Tick. Tock, reminding me that time is the only account no habit can replenish. That truth sharpened my discipline. I began to calculate not just money, but minutes. Was this deal worth a year of my mornings? Was that purchase worth an hour of my peace? The more I measured by time instead of wealth, the freer I became. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. There came a season when my life looked, from the outside, like success. Offices filled with chatter, assistants bustling through hallways, contracts piling up like snowdrifts. Yet inside, I still clung to the same 5 habits. Colleagues mocked me for still writing in notebooks when I could afford software worth thousands. They laughed at my small apartment when I could buy houses in every city. They scoffed at my caution, my refusal to rush. But years later, when markets shifted again, many of them disappeared. My notebooks remained, filled with records of prudence, proof that simplicity was not poverty, but strength. The compounding continued, in money, in relationships, in self-knowledge. What had once been survival became abundance, and what had once been a habit became a philosophy. Wealth was never the goal, only the byproduct. The real goal was freedom. Freedom to choose, to walk away, to rest without fear, to work with integrity. That freedom was purchased not in sudden windfalls, but in small, repeated acts that no one applauded. That is the irony of wealth. It is built in silence and enjoyed in ways too subtle for the world to notice. And so, each day still begins the same. A notebook, a pen, a cup of coffee, the ticking of a clock in the half-light of dawn. A man staring into the mirror, holding keys heavy in his pocket, asking not what he owns, but who he is becoming. And then, quietly, choosing again to live by the habits that built everything, and will continue to build, long after others have forgotten where it all began. Where it all began is a place I return to often in my memory, though the building itself is long gone. The cracked steps, the door with peeling paint, the faint smell of damp wood that clung to everything inside. It was not a palace of opportunity, but it was mine. I can still feel the uneven floorboards under my shoes and hear the faint scurrying of mice in the walls as I stayed late into the night, hunched over papers that seemed more like riddles than promises. That place taught me the hardest truth of all. If you cannot be faithful in obscurity, you will be reckless in abundance. Those early nights, I would pause my work and listen to the hum of the street outside, the low rumble of buses dragging their tired engines through the darkness, the faint laughter of people spilling out of bars. I was not part of their world. My world was smaller, quieter, but it pulsed with a different kind of urgency. The urgency of survival, yes, but also the urgency of becoming. Every coin I tracked, every hour I protected, was an act of defiance against the silence that tried to smother me. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. When the first true profits came, I celebrated not with champagne, but with solitude. I bought myself a second-hand chair, leather, cracked. The smell of age and smoke embedded deep within it, and placed it by the window of that crumbling office. Sitting there, I looked out at the street lamps flickering in the fog and whispered to myself, "Do not lose the hunger." That chair became a throne of humility. Long after I could afford better, I kept it, a relic of a time when every decision mattered more than I could admit. The hunger did not always feel noble. At times, it was gnawing, a restlessness that robbed me of sleep. I wanted more, yes, but I also feared less. Fear is a strange companion. It can either cripple you or sharpen you. For me, fear became a blade, cutting away complacency. Each morning, when the world was still wrapped in darkness, I sharpened that blade in the silence. Coffee, notebook, mirror. Fear transformed into discipline when met with ritual. Without the ritual, fear would have eaten me alive. The habit of saving proved itself again and again. Once, in the midst of what others called prosperity, I set aside nearly half of my earnings into accounts I refused to touch. People mocked me for my caution. Some even accused me of cowardice. Yet when the market crashed and voices turned to panic, I sat at my desk with steady hands. The accounts were not just numbers, they were anchors. They held me steady while the storm howled around me. Saving is not about denying yourself pleasure. It is about granting yourself peace when chaos comes. If my words have value for you, support this channel by subscribing and sharing your dream below. I learned also that generosity must be disciplined, or it turns to poison. In the flush of early success, I gave too freely. Loans to friends, investments into dreams that had no roots, handouts meant to soothe guilt rather than create growth. Each time, I watched as the money dissolved, leaving resentment in its place. The lesson was brutal. Generosity without wisdom destroys both giver and receiver. So I adjusted. I built rules, just as I had with saving. I gave, but I gave through structures, through plans, through commitments that built rather than broke. In time, my giving became like my saving. Consistent, deliberate, sustaining. The mirror continued to haunt me. Some mornings it was kind, reflecting back a man steady and resolved. Other mornings it was merciless, showing lines of fatigue and eyes clouded by compromise. I learned to thank it for both. The kind mornings gave me courage. The merciless ones gave me correction. Without the mirror, I would have drifted into the easy delusion that success meant righteousness. With it, I stayed tethered to the truth. Wealth does not sanctify. It only amplifies who you already are. Keys multiplied in my life until I carried them in 2 rings. Offices, warehouses, homes, safes. Their weight reminded me of responsibility, but also of choice. Each key was a threshold, and with thresholds come decisions. Some keys I carried for years before daring to use them. Others I threw away, realizing the doors they opened led only to rooms of regret. The sound of keys jingling in my pocket became a private liturgy, a reminder that access is not the same as destiny. Time. Always. Time. The clock in my office grew old with me. its hand still sweeping the same circle day after day. I replaced its batteries countless times, but its face remained the same, yellowed, cracked at the edges. I kept it deliberately because it reminded me of continuity. Wealth comes and goes, but time only goes. That clock became a tutor stricter than any market. Each tick was a warning, each talk an invitation. I learned to measure not how much money I could make in a year, but how much life I could live within it. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. I recall one night when I sat at my desk long after the city had gone to sleep. The papers were scattered, the air smelled of ink and stale coffee, and I felt both exhausted and alive. I looked at the ledger, the mirror, the clock, the keys lying heavy on the desk, and I realized they were no longer just objects. They were companions, motifs of my existence. They told my story better than headlines ever could. The notebook spoke of discipline. The savings account whispered of patience. The modest home testified to restraint. The mornings declared ownership of time. The keys sang of responsibility. And the mirror, always the mirror, reflected the man all these habits had made. I understood then that millionaires are not created in moments of brilliance, but in thousands of small, unseen acts repeated until they shape a soul. My life was proof of that. And as I closed the notebook that night, the clock striking softly in the background, I whispered the same vow I had written years before. Do not waste this. And with that vow, I continued. One more morning, one more habit, one more step down the long, unglamorous corridor that leads not just to wealth, but to the kind of freedom that can never be stolen. Freedom that can never be stolen does not arrive with a shout, but with a whisper. It sneaks in through the cracks of your discipline, quietly settling into your life until you realize you are no longer chained to the same fears that once defined you. I first recognized this freedom not in a transaction or a bank statement, but on a gray morning as I walked through the city. The rain had just stopped, leaving the streets slick and glistening under a weak sun. I passed by a shop window where a watch I had once longed for gleamed behind the glass. Years earlier, I would have felt the tug, the hunger to claim it. But that morning, I paused, smiled faintly at my reflection in the glass, and walked on. The real wealth was not that I could buy it, but that I no longer needed to. That realization changed the rhythm of my decisions. For so long, I had measured success by acquisition. The next deal, the next office, the next zero added to an account. But standing before that watch, with the smell of wet asphalt rising and the city beginning its noisy chorus, I understood that restraint was richer than possession. To have and not need, that was power. To need and not have, that was poverty, no matter the size of your accounts. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. Freedom reshaped how I saw others, too. I began to notice the desperation in voices around me. Partners who spoke too quickly. Employees who made choices from fear. Competitors who drowned in the noise of urgency. I recognized in them the man I had once been. Restless, grasping, haunted by the absence of security. I wanted to help, but I also knew that habits cannot be transferred like money. They must be built, brick by brick, in the silence of one's own mornings. So I shared my principles when asked, but I learned not to force them. A habit borrowed but not earned becomes a costume, impressive at first glance but easily torn. The clock reminded me daily that no habit is permanent unless it is practiced. Even now, with decades behind me, I rise before dawn and sit in the same ritual. Pen, notebook, silence. The smell of coffee mingling with the faint scent of paper. The light shifting slowly across the room. It would be easy to think I have outgrown the discipline, that I could relax and let the machine of success run itself. But the machine rusts without care, and the rust begins in the soul before it touches the gears. There were seasons when temptation whispered otherwise, when my name carried more weight than I ever imagined. Doors opened without me even knocking. Invitations arrived daily. Dinners in gilded rooms. Opportunities dressed as inevitabilities. The room smelled of perfume and polished wood. The conversation sparkled with laughter that rang too hollow. Each time, I carried the weight of my keys in my pocket and remembered, just because you can enter does not mean you must. Opportunity without alignment is a trap, and I had learned too much from earlier scars to fall willingly again. If my words have value for you, support this channel by subscribing and sharing your dream below. The scars, though, remain. There was a deal once that broke more than my balance sheet. It broke trust. I partnered with someone I believed in, a man whose words felt like iron, whose handshake felt like promise. Together, we built something that gleamed with potential. But beneath the surface, he carved away at the foundation for his own gain. When the collapse came, it was not the loss of money that crushed me. It was the taste of betrayal, bitter and metallic in the back of my throat. For weeks, I could hardly look in the mirror. I blamed myself not for trusting, but for ignoring the quiet warnings my habits had offered. The numbers had hinted. The rhythm had stuttered. The mirror had asked questions I refused to answer. Betrayal hurts most when you realize you betrayed yourself first. But habits heal. Slowly, deliberately, they stitched me back together. Tracking restored order where chaos had spilled. Saving built a cushion where emptiness had settled. Living below my means gave me room to breathe. Reflection forced me to face the cracks without flinching. And those protected mornings became a sanctuary where I rebuilt not just wealth, but confidence. From the rubble, I rose steadier, quieter, harder to deceive. The older I grew, the more I realized that wealth is not only the freedom to say yes, its greater gift is the freedom to say no. No to vanity, no to speed, no to the voices that demand your time without deserving it. Each no sharpened the value of every yes, and those yeses, chosen carefully, multiplied far beyond what reckless ambition could ever achieve. If my words resonate with you, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and leave a like. It supports the journey. Now, when I walk through the corridors of my life, the keys in my pocket still jingle, the clock still ticks, the mirror still waits. They are not reminders of burden, but of blessing. They keep me tethered, grounded, human. Because the truth is this: millionaires are not built in the glare of spotlight moments. They are built in the shadows of quiet mornings, in the ink of notebooks no one will ever read, in the coins saved when no one is watching, in the decisions that look small until years reveal their weight. And so I continue, step by step, habit by habit, not toward an end, but toward a practice. For in the end, wealth is not something you hold in your hands. It is something you carry in your habits, in your time, in the mirror of who you become, while the clock ticks and the world sleeps. The world sleeps, and I sit once more in the half-light of morning. The coffee cools beside me, the pen rests in my hand, and the notebook waits with quiet patience. Outside, the city begins its restless hum. Footsteps, engines, voices rising into the day. But here, in this stillness, the rhythm of my life is set. The mirror on the wall reflects a face older now, lined by years of both loss and gain, yet steadier than the boy who once counted coins at a kitchen table. The keys on the desk glint faintly, heavy with all the doors they have opened, all the rooms I have walked through, all the responsibilities I have carried. And the clock, always the clock, ticks with the same indifferent honesty as it did when I had nothing. What began as survival grew into freedom, and what grew into freedom became discipline, and what became discipline turned into peace. These 5 habits, tracking every step, saving before spending, living below my means, investing time before money, and protecting my mornings, were never glamorous. They were small, ordinary, almost invisible. Yet they built a life extraordinary, not because of its wealth, but because of its clarity. Money gave me choices, yes, but habits gave me meaning. And in the end, meaning is the only currency that compounds beyond death. For the wealth I leave behind will be counted, divided, perhaps forgotten. But the discipline I lived, the rhythms I practiced, the mornings I guarded, these are the true inheritance, written not in ledgers, but in the way I lived. So I leave you with this. Wealth is not a destination. It is a daily practice. It is not built in noise, but in silence. Not in leaps, but in steps. Not in moments of brilliance, but in habits repeated until they shape the soul. If you would build freedom, build discipline. If you would hold fortune, first learn to hold yourself. And if you stayed with me until the end, subscribe, like, and comment, so that these words will find you again tomorrow night.